Welcome back. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about astrological forecasting, then this is for you. This time we're going to be looking at retrogrades. Now typically one or two planets will be retrograde at any given time. On occasion you get it that no planets are retrograde. In general, there will be some planets retrograde, and that I'm talking also about transiting what's up there right now and also in your birth chart. So most birth charts have one or two planets that are retrograde, but now and again you do get a period where there are no planets retrograde. Whether a planet is retrograde or not actually depends on the position of that planet, the Earth and the Sun at the time. And in this video I'm going to be talking about the 5 parts to a retrograde cycle, so you can understand the key moments during a retrograde cycle. So let's get started. The 5 parts of a retrograde cycle. Let's have a look at it. So first of all, what does the word retrograde mean? So to retrograde, it means to seem to go backwards. So the idea is that we have this impression of something going backwards. And actually retrogradation is an optical illusion. If you have 2 trains going the same way and you are on the faster moving train and the slower moving train seems to go backwards. So what we have is that the faster moving train actually is the Earth and the slower moving train is actually the other planet, the retrograding planet, and that's the perception we have. Even though both are moving forward, one appears to be going backwards. Not all planets will retrograde, and the planets that do retrograde are Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Chiron, Uranus, Neptune and Pluto. And of course all the asteroids if you're using those, and Eris as well. And then we actually have a couple of planets that do not retrograde in a chart, and they will never be retrograde in your chart. And the first one is actually the Sun, which as we know technically is not a planet, it is a star. However, in astrology we always refer to the Sun as a planet, and that will never be retrograde in your chart. The Sun is always direct. And then the second planet that does not retrograde is the Moon. So both the Sun and the Moon, also known as the luminaries, they are never retrograde. And to be honest, this is a very old joke. Do you have a retrograde Sun or Moon? The new student is frantically looking at their chart to decide, have I got a retrograde Sun or Moon? And it's just an old astrology joke, so you don't want to get caught with that one. And let's just consider how retrograde planets are shown on a chart. And typically in most charts, when they are retrograde, the actual degree numbers will be in red. So you can see we have Saturn at 1 degree 50 Aquarius, we have Jupiter at 2706 Capricorn, and we have Pluto at 2449 Capricorn. Those are 3 outer planets that happen to be retrograde. And then also on this particular chart we have Venus retrograde at 20 degrees 05 minutes Gemini. And those degree points are written in red when the planet is retrograde. You will notice that the Sun and Moon are written in white, and all the other planets are, their degree positions are in white because this is a dark chart. If it was a light chart, the degree positions would be in black. But all retrograde planets will have their degrees written in red when it's on a chart. And if you look in an ephemeris, how retrograde planets are shown in an ephemeris, which is a book about planetary positions, you can see that where the shaded columns are, that is the Venus column, is shaded from the retrograde point. We also have the Jupiter shaded in there. Saturn is shaded for retrograde, and Pluto was actually retrograde the whole of the month. So here you can clearly see in an ephemeris that retrograde planets are shown in grey. If you have planets that are retrograde in your chart, write them in the comments below. Let's just have a bit of a quick definition about what's the difference between an inferior and a superior planet. And quite simply, the inferior planets, their orbits lie between the Sun and the Earth. So typically that is Mercury and Venus. And a superior planet has its orbit outside the Earth's orbit. So it's virtually from Mars onwards, they are superior planets. And why we're talking about this now is because the inferior and the superior planets have different patterns of retrogradation, which we'll be looking at in a moment. So the inferior planets that will retrograde are Mercury and Venus. And this is their pattern. What happens is the planet comes along direct on the blue line. The arrow points the direction that the planet is going. On the diagram, you can see the sun in the middle. The inferior planet, either Mercury or Venus, will be on the circle just outside the sun. And then the Earth is on the second concentric circle outside the sun. So the symbol there of the circle with a cross in it, that is the Earth. And what happens is when the inferior planet moves along direct, it's going typically anti-clockwise at this point, direct. It will then get to the position number 1, and that will be where the retrograde period starts. It will then retrograde back across through the blue to the, that will be your full retrograde period. It will then eventually stop, and it will turn direct again and continue on across the zodiac. And it's because the planets and the Earth are moving at the same time, and you can see specifically where these positions of the planets are through 1, 2, 3, and 4. At the second position, the planet will be conjoin the sun as well. So that is the diagram for the inferior planets when retrograde. And then the superior planets, which will be retrograde, are Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Chiron, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And they have a slightly different diagram because now we are looking out away from the sun. So the example I have here is the sun is in the middle, the Earth is on the first circular orbit, and then I've got the example there is Saturn on the second circular orbit. And as Saturn gets into the positions coming around, from the first position we can quite clearly see that we see it retrograde when the Earth is towards the top of the chart on its orbit. As we look out to Saturn, because the Earth is going faster, it virtually passes Saturn, and it looks as though Saturn is going backwards. So typically the superior planet will be retrograde when it is in the opposite side of the chart to the sun. So there are basically 5 points to a retrograde cycle. We have the pre-shadow, the station retrograde, the retrograde period, the station direct, and the after shadow. So here's another diagram of a retrograde, of the actual cycle of the retrograde. What happens is the planet is coming along at the top in the green. It enters the pre-shadow. It will continue on on the white path. It will go along the pre-shadow. Then it starts to slow down as it's coming towards the station retrograde. At that particular point, it will then start to retrograde back, and it will slowly move away from the station. It will then make its retrograde period going backwards, and this is 3 times slower than when it's going forward. So it is much slower moving going backwards. It will then slow down even further as it comes to the station direct. At the point of the turning at the station, it will then slowly pick up speed again, pass outside of the after shadow, and then carry on the green arrow on its direct motion. So a planet will come in, enter the shadow, have a station retrograde, go through the retrograde period, create the station direct, and then pass out of the after shadow, moving direct, and finally clear the whole shadow there. So when the planet enters the pre-shadow, it's still moving directly, but we know it's within the shadow period. And the whole shadow period itself is where we will have the 3 hits to the chart, because the planet's going to pass those particular degrees 3 times. Once direct, once retrograde, and once direct again. So at the pre-shadow, this starts when the planet passes the place where it will station direct later in the cycle. So we know this is the bubbling under of the actual retrograde period. At the station retrograde, this starts when the planet is within 0 degrees, 10 minutes to the station retrograde position. So if the planet is actually retrograding at 10 degrees Gemini, when it gets to 950 Gemini, it is considered stationary, and whilst it is up until 10 degrees 10 minutes Gemini, it is still considered stationary. Now, solar fire will put an S on the chart if the planet is stationary. So orbs for stations. Planets are considered stationary when they are within 0 degrees 10 minutes of either station, either the retrograde station or the direct station. After that, we then have the full-blown retrograde period. This starts at the station retrograde and it lasts until the station direct. This is the retrograde period where the planet is actually considered to be retrograde. Then we get to the station direct, and this again begins when the planet is within 0 degrees 10 minutes of the station direct position, and it will last until 10 minutes after as well. Then the planet is in the after shadow. This starts at the station direct and lasts until the planet clears the station retrograde point in the zodiac. So then in general, with the retrograde period, the pre-shadow and the after shadow are as long in longitude as the retrograde period, although they are as not the same length in time. Personally, I have the Sun, Mercury and Saturn retrograde in my chart. No, not the Sun, that's the joke. I only have Mercury and Saturn retrograde in my chart. If you have planets that are retrograde in your chart, write them down in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. I'm Alison Price. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.